Join me on the trail of John Ashworth of Rochdale again. This is a town centre trail and we're here on Lomax Street and the northeast side of the town centre. We're at the junction of Lomax Street and Princess Street. This is Richmond Hall. There was a lady called Mrs. Bowden who attended John Ashworth's Chapel for the Destitute, and Mr. Ashworth said she lived on Lomax Street with her son James, who was dying of consumption. Before she was a Christian, Mary Bowden spent most of her time focusing on housework and eating and sleeping, rather than thinking about the salvation of her own soul. But when her husband John died in 1858, she became more thoughtful about God. She realised she was a sinner and went from church to find rest for her soul. But it was at John Ashworth's Chapel for the Destitute that tears flowed, and she heard God say to her, "Your faith has saved you, go in peace." Mrs. Bowden was filled with joy and told all her friends and neighbours about the love of God. When Mrs. Bowden's own health started to fail, she lay in the other bed next to her son. She cried tears as she heard him praying for himself, and he received salvation for himself on his deathbed. Mr. Ashworth visited them and he said, "I felt it a solemn moment to kneel between the two beds, where two immortal spirits were just stepping on the borders of the invisible world." One day during her sickness, one of Mrs. Bowden's grandchildren said to her, "Grandmother, pray to Jesus, he can make you well again." And Mrs. Bowden replied, "I know Jesus can make me well, dear, but I'm going to where I shall see him, and then I shall be poorly no more." James Bowden prayed to be buried the same day as his mother, and his request was granted. They died at around the same time, and on the day of the funeral, the 3rd of February 1869, the two coffins were brought out of the cottage in Lomax Street, John Ashworth says, together, and over the same grave at the same moment the solemn service was read over both mother and son. Now, although John Ashworth describes the coffins being brought out of the cottage on Lomax Street, I could not find that the Bowdens actually lived on Lomax Street. I found them living on Elliot Street, which is a little further along here, another road parallel to Lomax Street. But it's possible that the family, the Bowdens, moved from Elliot Street at the time of the census around the corner to Lomax Street, where they lived at the time of Mrs. Bowden and James Bowden's deaths. So this is Elliot Street, which is where the Bowden family lived at one point. They were definitely living there in 1861. In his tale about Mrs. Bowden, John Ashworth includes a description of a storm which took place in December 1868 On that day, Mr. Ashworth was at the opening of a new Sunday school building near the junction of Clark's Lane and Mitchell Street on Spotland Road. And during the service, which was late in the afternoon, there was a huge storm and it blew the roof off the church, off the building, and the walls fell in and many people were injured. Nobody was killed, but there's a record of that incident in the annals of Rochdale, and Mr. Ashworth described what happened in his tale about Mrs. Bowden. The Bowden's family grave is at Rochdale Cemetery, although I can't find a headstone on the grave or the exact location of it, but that is where they're buried. Now this is West Street, just off Halifax Road. Although there's no street sign for it. Number 14 West Street was the home of a spinster named Miss Eleanor Ormerod. And Miss Eleanor Ormerod was one of 3 ladies who, along with John Ashworth, was instrumental in establishing a female refuge in Rochdale in 1860. Now this is where, that's number 12, and that's number 16 on the corner of Ball Street. So this is where number 14 West Street was, in this gap. We're now on Ball Street, and this is Ball Street Gardens. Mr. Ashworth and his first wife Jane had 2 sons named John and William, who both died in infancy. One died very suddenly when he was about a year old, and the other was scalded when he was about 4 years old and died after lingering a short time. Both sons were laid to rest in St. Stephen's churchyard, here. It's now Ball Street Gardens. So this is where St. Stephen's Church once stood. This little street down here is called Roach Place, and I did find out that another family who are mentioned in one of John Ashworth's stories, the Harrison family, lived here. That's actually from one of Mr. Ashworth's Simple Records, another series of books that he wrote in the 1870s. Mr. Ashworth and his wife Jane had many years of happy married life, but Jane began to feel great pain in walking, which lasted several months, and following a consultation with 3 doctors, it was deemed necessary to amputate her foot in order to save her life. After the operation, she gradually declined in health until she was entirely confined to her room and then to her bed. Mrs. Ashworth died in 1849 and was also buried here in St. Stephen's churchyard. There are no gravestones for the graves and the burials at St. Stephen's, but this is also where the Friends Meeting House, the Quakers, used to be, and there are some gravestones from people who were buried here, including John Bright, the MP who knew John Ashworth. When he was describing how God's presence imparts unspeakable joys to millions of dying Christians, Mr. Ashworth once wrote, "Never yet was dying strength withheld from dying saints." And after his wife Jane died, he said, "The rapturous felicity, the joys unspeakable of the last few weeks of her life can never be told." St. Stephen's Church first opened in 1812 and it was demolished in 1949. I found Mrs. Ashworth's death certificate and the record of her death, but I couldn't find the record of her burial here at St. Stephen's, and I couldn't find the records for the 2 sons, John and William, who were buried here at St. Stephen's.